All right, looks like we're recording. Great, Richard, thank you for talking with me about the history of work and the future of work. So maybe we could start with an introduction and then we'll kick off the conversation.
Sure, Joel. My name's Richard Donkin. I'm a former journalist at the Financial Times. I've written 2 books on work, the history of work and the future of work. And yeah, they were compiled some time ago, but I don't think many of the factors that certainly were involved in the history of work have changed fundamentally since I wrote those books. The first one was written in around about 2000, and the second 10 years later.
Great. I wonder if you could kind of kick us off with some thoughts on looking at the last 150 years or so of the history of work and the move into kind of the industrial age and the factory worker. Then came the knowledge worker, and then the virtualization of knowledge now into the 21st century. And maybe kind of highlight some of the evolutions and maybe some of the ways that we think about, you know, what work looks like today that might be different, and maybe in some of the ways that we're clinging to, you know, traditional notions or even industrial notions of value creation and what it means to work.
Okay, so if we're going back 150 years, we're going back into the Victorian era. So by that time, we'd already had the what many historians call the Industrial Revolution, the beginning of the factory system, the creation of the job itself. None of these could be taken for granted before that happened. But when it did happen, I think there was certain observations by some people that you know, work could be achieved in a better way. People like Adam Smith, for instance, looked at the pin factory and how division of labor enabled the production of pins in a much more efficient way, much larger numbers than one person could turn out if they were turning out at making a single pin. And yeah, at the same time, you have these large industrial operations beginning particularly in the US. I mean, if you think of the Industrial Revolution in the UK being based on textiles, which it was, in the US it was probably more based on steel and the railroads, one feeding the other. And I think one of the interesting figures of that time is Frederick Winslow Taylor and the work that he did on, well, introducing us to work study. Why did he do it then? Well, it was a confluence of interests, really, and innovation. He was an obsessive, and he would have studied anything, but work seemed to be a good idea when he moved into a company called Midvale on the outskirts of Chicago. And there the operatives, the machine operatives, were working to what was called working to rule, in that they had a rule that they used for their measurements, but there were no, on the calibrations, there were no figures laid down. So it was very difficult for anybody in management to understand just how they did work. They certainly, the artisan workers were controlling their own work. And Taylor himself thought he wanted to break this mold, and he wanted to know more about it. So he started to break down work into its constituent parts and to measure it, to measure how each action took place. And he could do that because a stopwatch that could measure elapsed time had been invented around about 1860 in Switzerland, and he'd been to Switzerland in a tour of Europe with his parents. So this was a relatively new innovation, and it was regarded as being, I suppose, almost seditious in the workplace. So he hid the watch in a book when he was doing his timings. Through that and through other work he did at Bethlehem Steelworks, where he was trying to find the perfect labourer, he introduced the concept of you know, time studies. At least we didn't get the motion studies until the engineers at the Ford factory, the factory that Ford was establishing in Highland Park to build the Model T car. His engineers were taking ideas from well, the meatpacking factories in Chicago was one. Another one was the Venice shipyards, where going back in the 15th century, they were building ships that were moving through a canal and then just adding the parts to the ships as the ships moved through. So that was an early example of moving assembly. And they melded their ideas of moving assembly with Taylor's ideas on scientific management of measuring work, bringing work down into its constituent parts, into bits, if you like. And we're able to produce you know, massive increases in the numbers of cars. The output was astonishing in 1 year. And they were saving an awful lot of money in doing so, because it was a lot more efficient way of working. But they, you know, and these people were, other industrialists were learning from these ideas at the time, making their own factories, people like Singer sewing machines. And because they were able to make things so cheaply, they were helping to create this idea of the consumer society. It was a sort of a virtuous economic circle. People were earning enough to buy the things that they were producing, because one thing Ford did was increase the wage rates to an enormous degree. I mean, the Wall Street Journal at the time thought it was a stupid idea, but you know, he could afford to do it. He could afford to pay a huge amount back to his initial backers, his stakeholders, and also give his employees a big wage rise. So that was a big step, and scientific management became almost a cult. It had cult status in companies all over the world, or more progressive companies all over the world, and it started establishing itself in the nascent business schools. So one of the next big leaps, perhaps, was the Hawthorne study at the factory of Western Electric that made telephone relays. Western Electric was one of the new electricity companies coming out of Edison's developments. Thomas Edison was another pioneer, another sort of workplace pioneer, in the sense that his collaborators who worked with him, he described them as muckers. In other words, they were guys who were just having a good time, mucking in, enjoying the way they worked. There was no sense of Taylorism in Edison's workshop. It was an ideas workshop. And Ford was a big fan of Edison, and indeed he reproduced his original workshop in his museum that he set up. Ford was a big collector of buildings and that kind of thing. So he produced a statue of Edison at Greenbourne, I think it was. So General Electric emerged from Edison's work, and it was desperately trying to sell electricity into the factory system, but hadn't established to the factory owners why they should be buying this stuff. Why should they switch from gas lighting, which they nearly all had, to electricity. I mean, one thing Edison and one thing General Electric understood was that it wasn't just about the power itself, it was about the supply of the power. Unfortunately, they were able to use a lot of the gas infrastructure, but they thought they needed something else, some kind of marketing ploy, and they came up with the idea of they called it the science of seeing. In other words, you know, electricity was much brighter, so you could be, surely if you were had much more illumination on your workstation, you could work more productively. So in you know, they brought in some Harvard academics to set up some studies. We're talking about around about the mid-1920s. So you're in Chicago at that time. You know, it was the it was you know, just coming towards the end of Prohibition. There was people like Al Capone and gangsters in the streets, and yet there were these there was this sort of group of people setting up studies in the Hawthorne factory to try and establish that lighting was going to make people more productive. And at first, when they put some women together in a workshop. They were handpicked, put together, and when they brought in the electric lighting, production went up, and it went up again when they increased the luminosity of the lighting. So everything was going swimmingly, and then they turned down the lighting to about the equivalent of moonlight, and extraordinarily for them, production went up again. Now this didn't kind of fit the mold for General Electric. So they kind of lost interest in it and buried the findings, but the people at Hawthorne didn't care about what General Electric thought. They were more interested in, you know, the results of the findings, and decided to continue the studies. And that was the beginning of this. They brought in this Australian, Elton Mayo, to have a look at the findings. And although not everything that they found established this belief, it fitted some of the ideas of Mayo sufficiently for him to come up with the idea that if you treated people well in a factory setting, and you encouraged them and made them feel special, then they would be more productive for you. There was one experiment that looked at pay, the influence of pay, but they kind of pushed that to one side. You know, it was an important factor, but they kind of tried to ignore that. So it did. Hawthorne was the thing that sort of brought in the human relations school of work, and then you had this. I suppose it was shifted on to the academics and the people like Peter Drucker, Frederick Herzberg, Maslow, Douglas McGregor. These kind of people were doing various studies that all showed that, you know, all sort of reinforced Mayo's ideas. One of the figures who is worth mentioning at this time was Mary Parker Follett. You know, she didn't get enough credit for her work, probably because she was a woman, but she had this idea, this theory that you know, companies were, to some extent still are, autocracies, but she said that, you know, power, what she called power with, was just as important as, or probably more important than power over people. So it's a very simple concept, and it would influence you know, people like Rosabeth Moss-Kanter with their ideas of empowerment, and people like Peter Drucker, who was, you know, fascinated by the idea of self-managed plants and self-managed teams. So, you know, this was going back, you know, we're talking about them. Well, Drucker's practice of management was 1950s, 55. And so it was the 60s when people were coming out, like people like Frederick Herzberg was coming out with the idea of, you know, allowing people to organize their own work in a way that suited them. And he talked about hygiene factors as being, results of either job satisfaction or job dissatisfaction. And it could be something at home, it could be something in the workplace. Abraham Maslow tried to, theorize on some of these things when he came out with his hierarchy of needs that wasn't really based on any study. But he did have some assumptions about working people, and three for me stand out. One was to assume an innate preference for work in people, and a preference for meaningful, purposeful work, and also to assume that people should, certainly from the first instance, be trusted in the workplace. And McGregor took that on, Douglas McGregor, with his theory X and theory Y. Theory X was that the idea that people were disinclined to work, that they preferred direction, they wanted job security, they had no ambition or little desire for responsibility. But then he also had theory Y, which was that there was no, and this was the one that he felt was more important, that there was no built-in aversion to work, that mental effort in work was as natural as taking time off or enjoying leisure, and that people were capable of self-control and self-direction in the workplace. And some of these were married. Then we come to the end of we finished the Second World War. You had the emerging economies of Japan and Germany, who were rebuilding their economies from scratch. Japan, with the help of young American engineers and consultants. Germany, with quite a bit of help from the UK trade unions, who were setting up works councils where they couldn't even set them up in their own country. But in Japan, they had I think there was already an interest in quality, but when they brought in people like Deming and Joseph Juran, who were statistical analysis people, but they were, when they melded this statistical approach to trying to produce excellent products, particularly in the car industry, they really knocked the spots off the American competition, and it took some time for America to realize what was happening in Japan. So then you had this rise of Japanese industry, and by this time, all these things are being written up in management studies, in management schools, in books. So you would think that companies would be falling over themselves to adopt a lot of these ideas, but yet it took 20, 30 years sometimes to filter into Western production systems. When Duran came over to the UK and spoke to Rolls-Royce about the benefits of eliminating waste, they were not interested. They were purely focused on sales. The idea that you could make profit by getting rid of waste hadn't really sunk in. Again, in the US, they were the focus was very much on building good cars, but they omitted certain things. They were design focused rather than production focused, and they just did not have the robustness of quality control that the Japanese had, and it showed. And so yeah, these were sort of the sort of studies that were taking us up to round about the millennium. But just before the millennium, of course, about 3 or 4 years before the millennium, we had started to have the impact of the internet and a whole new revolution, the information revolution, or the knowledge revolution, or however you want to call it, that was sort of coming, what was very much a grassroots movement, and emerging with people who didn't really know. I mean, they knew about coding. There was a lot of, again, it was coming out of the university, particularly the West Coast, particularly places like Stanford. People had they understood they had something to play with, but they didn't really quite understand what it was. I mean, I think the World Wide Web was probably, creating this opportunity for people to work with few restrictions, few barriers. It was kind of an open season for information technology, and so these young people, very often with just playing with ideas, like Facebook originally was not intended to be what it is now. Twitter originally was not intended to be what it is now. It's rather like the telephone originally. It was an invention without them really quite understanding how it might be used. And it's almost as if we'll make the thing, and it's up to you to pick it up and use it. And to some extent, that's where we are now. Though, I was writing 20 years ago about the shift into home working, and yet it still hasn't really happened until this last 12 months, when needs must, and companies are now getting used to the idea, because there's still this urge to control. There's still this belief in managers that we've got to keep an eye on people, and some of the technologies that they've introduced into the information workplace are ones that are sort of looking at cursor movements and things like that. Which is like old-fashioned forms of control. You would think those wouldn't have any place in today's workplace, because they're based fundamentally on a lack of trust. But there they are, and it's difficult to iron that out of the system. But it's quite interesting that it's taken a pandemic for a lot of companies to really confront this thing. But even now, I think a lot of governments and economies are hiding away from it. Certainly in the UK, people are being encouraged to go back into the workplace simply to spend more. And then I guess that feeds into modern economics, which is not an entirely unrelated story, but it is another story.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I can't believe how much you covered in that synopsis of the last 100 years. I mean, from Adam Smith's Economic Man and Taylorism to the Hawthorne Studies, all the way to Drucker and into the knowledge revolution. I think there's so much there. One of the things that kind of comes up for me as I'm hearing you speak is this tension that I think, and you're kind of, by proxy putting your finger on it here with this idea of working from home and control, but this tension between, maybe it's the theory X, theory Y a little bit, between management structures and systems and operational structures and systems really being designed as mechanisms for control and observation, modern stopwatches, if you will, right?
Yeah.
And that kind of presuppositional posture of the organization as one that has to keep the stopwatch, has to observe, has to control the lighting, has to ensure, right, that people are in their seats doing their work, time cards, all of that thing, really grounded in a Tayloristic notion of value creation, that and the idea, maybe the belief about humans, that they're not intrinsically incentivized or motivated to work. But then there's that tension, because we see throughout the 20th century that there are theorists who do believe that, well, if you create positive conditions, there are different factors that either internally or externally motivate people, that ideas like self-determination and purposeful work actually can compel people to be more productive. You're looking at people like Maslow talking about actualization and look, if you can cover the basic needs, that you're going to access an element of human performance that you wouldn't otherwise meet or access. And I see this tension even today where you have organizations that are really struggling with the work from home idea because of these kinds of, again, kind of their belief about humans and how humans behave, that they need to be observed and controlled, that the factors of performance are external, not internal. Yet on the other side, you see people like Frederick Laloux and others, the holacracy movement, that are really leaning into the flip side, which is no, humans do have an inclination to work, that they do want to lean into something meaningful and purposeful, and that motivation and drive is intrinsic, and you have to create conditions for that. Then in the background, you have this kind of Puritan work ethic, which is this idea that there is a moral there's a moral dimension of work, and that if you're not working, it's a moral failure, or that the lack of work or unemployment is a moral failure. And so all of these things have kind of created this milieu of work in kind of modern history, specifically in Western culture, where we've become such a work-centric society, that even our education system for the last 150 years has been oriented around creating workers, right? So I wonder if you could speak to, what are some of the tensions that you think this kind of global work from home experiment is really amplifying? And maybe these are tensions that have existed for a long time, but the work from home experiment globally is really amplifying and forcing us to face. For example, we're being forced to face the level of trust that we have in our employees, in our workforces, right? We have to confront that and deal with it. What are some of the things that you think companies are being forced to deal with, to face, to wrestle with today that have been long-standing issues, but maybe now is an opportunity to actually get somewhere and actually move the needle in a meaningful way?
You raised a few issues there, Joel. I think one of the long-standing issues that's not going to go away in a hurry is that middle and senior managers feel incredibly threatened by some of these forces, some of these, the idea that people can self-manage, the idea that people can organize their own work, is pretty undermining to the people who are supposed to be supervising it. And if anything, they need to change their approach. And I'm not sure that's coming out of the management schools sufficiently. They need to have they need to change their style to one of mentoring, one of enabling people to do their work. And sometimes you have to have an understanding of work styles to do that. I have managed myself, not in a big way, but I had a small team. And I noticed that one of the people who worked for me in my team liked to work strict hours. I didn't particularly, but it was important to her. So it had to be important to me as a manager to ensure that she could she could work in that way, because she was an incredibly productive employee, and exactly had the other thing is, like a lot of managers today, I did not have her skills, and I chose her because she had skills that I didn't have. I mean, what was the point of choosing somebody who just could do the things that I could do, or I could do exactly what they were doing? I needed somebody who had specialist skills that I didn't have, and probably an approach to work that I didn't have, because that would make the whole team, to my mind, work better. But I think that was probably not typical of managers. I think those that get through to the boardroom have the opportunity to be a bit more reflective on, in this area. Unfortunately, they're not always able to control things at the workplace. They're not there. They're working on strategies, and they're dealing with the finances, and they've got a multifaceted approach to the operation. They've got to have a kind of helicopter view of the operation. And of course, there's often subsidiaries and shareholders, and then the customers and supply chains, all to look after. So actually, looking after the workforce is not always a priority, or something that they can get involved with, or particularly want to get involved with. I mean, people are difficult. People are, it's not an easy area to work, and unfortunately, the group that have been assigned to look after people in the workplace, the personnel officers, now prefer to be called HR people, HR management, are not always terribly well equipped to do their work, and will typically bring in consultants or bring in other experts to cover their fields. And they're rather often, and often rightly so, looked down upon by other members of management. They're not given very often status in companies. They're not promoted to the board level. These have been sort of long-standing issues for HR management. So I think that there are structural problems in a lot of what I might call traditional companies, although I use that word, I use that word very loosely, because even now, I mean, now companies like Amazon have been around long enough, Google, Facebook, all the information technology companies have been around long enough to have established themselves and established certain work practices, but they're still regarded by a lot of production companies that actually make things and have assets that are sort of would be recognizable by some of the people I've been mentioning earlier. They're still regarded with some sort of suspicion, or as being sort of wacky companies. But it's almost like the beginnings of the car manufacturing industry, where there were lots and lots of companies. There were scores of companies around Detroit making cars at the turn of the 19th century, and then through amalgamations and takeovers, they were reduced to 2 or 3 big powerhouses like Ford and General Motors. To some extent, that's happening in information technology. A lot of companies have emerged and disappeared. You now have the giants like Google and Amazon, and you've got people like Microsoft now and Apple are almost like old hands. But you get these tensions between these companies. I mean, Microsoft and Apple is a really fascinating example, because there you've got a company, Microsoft, that is happy and comfortable with open sourcing, the idea that anybody can make an app or a piece of software or whatever. And Apple, that took, certainly under Steve Jobs, quite a bit of convincing that this was a good idea, and was more interested in having something that was that, yes, it worked well, but was beautiful and aesthetically attractive. So your Microsoft will be your kind of shaky jalopy a little bit, maybe a Model T, whereas Apple would be trying to be a Ferrari, something that looked good and worked well. But was it inclusive? And taking up this point about companies feeling threatened, companies have always wanted to maintain their secrets, to protect their copyrights, and this is strong today as it ever was. And yet the the whole idea of open sourcing is saying, hey, we can make something better if we throw our doors open and let everybody use this thing. It's what Tim Berners-Lee did with the World Wide Web. It was a fantastic gift to humanity. And, what's the worst that can happen? So you get companies like, Pinterest emerging, something I use, something I enable for myself, in that I have lots of photographs. I don't mind people using them to pin them everywhere if they just enjoy them. I think some people are starting to relax about things like copyright, and some people are still quite strong on it. China's almost built an economy on copying, and it's now having to deal with, the re-emergence of protectionism. So this is where I'm going off track a little bit. So maybe.
Well, if I could I think you said a few things that I want to highlight. I think one of the things that you brought up that I think is really critical. First, that this tension around how people are managed, and specifically how we think about the exchange of information through that system, and do we collaborate, externally? Do we exchange and share information externally, or do we try and keep it all contained? But what this highlights for me, and I think also with the example of Microsoft and Apple, is the idea of the value of creativity. And I wonder if you could speak to, you kind of started with this notion that management systems or models have yet to really evolve and adapt to kind of the modern needs. That control and middle management really is kind of rooted in a early 20th century heuristic of optimization and efficiency. But maybe today we need to rethink that. And this highlights for me creativity, right? That what optimization and efficiency and kind of a Tayloristic notion of management might promote is conformity, control, observation, efficiency, the measurable, the ability to put a metric, like key performance indicators, right? To put a metric to performance and outcomes in production. Whereas what we're seeing today is so much of the work that is quantifiable is also work that is automated, right? And so that's putting this, it's creating more space for work that's not easily automated, which kind of, goes against the grain of traditional notions of management and efficiency and optimization. So for example, today, to cultivate creativity within an organization, you can't really drive control and conformity. Control and conformity as a presuppositional kind of disposition towards people is not going to cultivate creativity. What is going to cultivate creativity is actually autonomy, right? Self-agency, self-expression, individuality, rather than conformity and control. So that puts a lot of pressure on managers to rethink the way that they manage, and rethink the way that they, what their role is within the organization. To your point about moving more towards being mentors and coaches, when many of the managers that are at the helm today are coming out of the late 80s, early 90s school of business, which was still grounded very much in a kind of a at best a Drucker kind of mindset, at worst very much Tayloristic mindset. So anyway, I'm now rambling, but if you could, maybe if you could speak to that idea of creativity and how we need to rethink those paradigms and the prevailing paradigm of management today based on the evolution that we've seen, especially in recent history?
Well, unfortunately today, most managers are still very much administrators. They're not chosen for their creativity. The creative people are needed where they can be most use at the innovative, at the cutting edge. Say, any company that wants to reinvent itself has to have its creative people, coming up with ideas and creating. Companies like 3M, for example, that allows employees to have, in theory, 20% of their time to work on their own projects. And a lot of these own projects then create products that we know the famous ones like the Post-it note and sellotape and what have you, or Scotch tape, whatever. You would think lots of companies would have copied 3M and copied that idea, but they haven't. They tend to get they tend to cluster their production around one product, and that is the product that they go with, and they're very successful. And typically what happens is, after a while, the initiator of the product sees a way of selling out, buying out, and going off and riding off into the sunset, and does so. You rarely get a kind of Elon Musk figure emerging who is just full of ideas and what have you. And what I've noticed about Musk, incidentally, is that he is very much an ideas man, but he's certainly not a typical boss, and I certainly don't think he's probably a very good manager. But hopefully he will bring people around him who might introduce a little bit of, perhaps a bit of conservatism into his workplace. As I think he's probably a bit of a nightmare for all the usual people, the finance people, the shareholders, because he sometimes bigs up what he's doing. And at the same time, he's, for me, and I think for a lot of members of the public, quite an exciting figure. He's not one of the grey men in suits that we see. But yes, one of the problems with creativity is it's not something that's easy to scale up. Walt Disney is a good example of somebody who sort of created a sort of creative factory and had enormous loyalty from those around him, and yet he was to some extent an autocrat, but he was very much a perfectionist as well. He wanted perfection. He sought perfection in others, and in a way, I think a lot of creative people like to work together. They coalesce together, and I think that's it's not making, I suppose, Walt Disney films and cartoons, or making films at all, any kind of films, is a process where people are brought together, often by one individual, maybe a director who has, got some interesting ideas. People like Quentin Tarantino. If you look at what a lot of his films, they're built around set pieces. They're not always built around a very clear and obvious narrative that has a very clear beginning and a clear end. They're kind of, they have bits of the film that you think, hey, that's fantastic, that's great. And then what's that doing there, or whatever. But it's clear that people love to work for him and love some of the concept ideas. And it's also attracted, it's commercially sound. It's also attracted a viewing public. And so, what we have now, I mean, we had the film industry and we had the theatre and opera. So we did have creative industries, but we now have this massive, even bigger creative industry, which is the gaming industry, which is starting to have a big influence on people's lives in ways that we haven't yet been able to work out. I know I'm not a big gamer, but my sons are. In fact, they're in the business. They're independent games makers, but they also spend quite a bit of their social life, in the ether on the networks, speaking to people, not only while they're playing games, they're sort of, they're underpinning friendships, you know, so there's kind of corporations going on there. And it's this idea that, you know, if you're in one company, why can't your employees cooperate with the employees of another company without necessarily your knowledge or control? If you trust them to do that, then I don't see any problem with it. For instance, I never, as a journalist, sometimes I will be rung up by another media organization like the BBC or whatever, and asked my opinions of something that was to do with my workplace. I think there was an attempt to gag us from saying anything, which is quite common in a lot of companies, but I never went along with that because that's part of my nature perhaps. But you know, in a lot of companies these days, anything that's asked of any individual in the company is passed on to the public relations department or some other department that sort of centralizes control, because they're trying to protect the message or the reputation, sometimes a reputation that they that is illusory, that they think is there. And it comes down again to this old problem of trust. So it's a long-winded way of saying, you know, we still don't have the right management structures in place to get the best out of employees. You know, it's quite sad, I think, to see a company like Amazon producing these. I mean, it is a very you know, successful model of buying and selling and trading. But for some of the employees who are working on picking things in these windowless sheds, it must be quite a soul-destroying existence. You would think that the managements in these businesses would be focusing on trying to get the best environment, you know, have consultative teams that are discussing the best ways of doing things. You know, hopefully they are, but I certain some of the feedback I've seen coming out of these businesses does not support that. So I think there's still an awful lot to learn, but I'm not too worried, because you've got outfits like YouTube now. It's like a bit like the Wild West. You know, it's enabling people, again, because of low barriers to entry, it's enabling people to find a voice. If they can't find a voice in the workplace, they're finding a voice outside the conventional workplace. It doesn't take much to set up in your room with a laptop and a good quality microphone and a film camera, and suddenly become a vlogger or an influencer. I mean, this guy PewDiePie, is it called? You know, he's multi-millionaire through just engaging with young people in a way that sort of conventional companies just cannot do. So people, I mean, often they might be described as misfits. Sometimes they're very experienced people in their field who find a particular niche and work in that niche, and they're most of them seem to me to be one-man bands. I'm not seeing too many organizations building from this, but I think it will happen. So what you've got today, what you didn't have when I started work many moons ago, is a massive aggregation of you know, of platforms and outlets and possibilities for working. And I don't think, you know, companies used to talk about people moonlighting. They shouldn't think of it that way anymore. They should think in terms of, you know, we're proud for our people to go out and do things elsewhere, and we shouldn't be fixated on hours of work. I mean, hours of work or boxing work is a ridiculous thing. Yeah, if you work in a shop, you have to be open at certain hours. You can't do much about that. And if you work on a production line, yes, you have to work to your shift patterns. But as you mentioned yourself, a lot of these repetitive work, it's going to be replaced by robots. Robots are, coming in big time. Artificial intelligence is coming in big time. Probably, I think one of the most influential changes in the way we work will be developments in artificial intelligence. It's already happening. Usually when somebody says, well, there's this job that cannot be replicated by a machine, you often find that within 5 or 6 years, yes, it can. There are already writing algorithms, writing machines. I mean, since I wrote both of my books, perhaps one of the biggest developments, and we're seeing it everywhere, is the use and to some extent abuse of algorithms. They're filtering into all kinds of areas of work, and yeah, these are big issues. They're big issues for management academics. They're big issues for companies, and I think they're going to be wrestling with them. Unfortunately, I think because of the COVID-19, a lot of these things have been derailed somewhat, and we're seeing a return to kind of old-fashioned dynamics, old-fashioned thinking, old-fashioned concerns. And I'd like to have thought the workplace was becoming freer, but I'm not sure. I think to some extent it's becoming, or there's a danger that it could become even more restricted. But certainly there are more people now experimenting with working from home. It's not regarded now as a euphemism for doing what you like or playing around. And I think there is an understanding that that we don't actually work in head down all the time for 8 hours a day or 10 hours a day. I mean, coming back to Taylor, he called it what the workers at Midway were doing before he imposed his own will on them. Well, he called it soldiering, the idea that you work within yourself. Well, I think most people work within themselves. Again, as somebody who worked for many of his years to daily deadlines, there was a rhythm of the day that started very sort of easily and casually, and then built up as the day went on to a sort of frantic level, with a big sort of sigh or letdown at the end once the story had gone out of your hands. So there are rhythms of work, and people understand this, and people talk about flow when they know that their work is going well, and they feel in control of it, they're on top of it, they're not anxious about it, and they know they're producing good work. And we need to encourage that and accept that people can recognize this, and people with a bit of help often can build it into their working days. But we have to accept that people have to find other ways to introduce their social life or their everyday life into the workplace. If you can shop online and you can find 10 minutes to do your weekly shopping on an online ordering system, what's the harm in that? We used to have 10-minute tea breaks. People don't seem to have those anymore, but they congregate around the water cooler. But one thing that I do worry about, and I think what a lot of companies are grappling with at the moment, is the social side of work. Working from home is very isolating, or can be, and you're not mixing with colleagues. You're not necessarily exchanging ideas and doing all the things one hopes, which help to enrich not only your own working life, but the employer's work as well. You can get some of this stuff from the internet, a lot of it, but you still the danger is that we will kind of, our hardwiring will change, and that we will lose some of the natural social skills. I mean, I'm not comfortable, because I don't do it anymore, speaking on the telephone. It's something I rarely do. I'm much more comfortable using things like WhatsApp, although, you know, I think some people are turning this stuff into an art now, tweeting, WhatsApping, or whatever. They're working out how they can build these things into their work. They don't always do it very well. You know, sometimes they have to be reined in again. Hey, you can't say that about so-and-so because we don't understand the libel laws, or the, you know, the laws of slander. You know, even dare I say, the president of the United States needs a bit of instruction in that area.
Yeah. Well, Richard, I want to respect your time, so maybe we could just wrap it up real quick here,
Okay,
with one last question. I think, you know, in the last few minutes, you've made some really interesting points, and I wonder if you could just, in summation, in a world right now, and specifically, I think maybe this might just be from my perspective, many of my clients are obsessively concerned with the future of work. And what I love about what you've written in your study as a work historian, you're really putting a pin in the idea that so much of what we're concerned with today has been thought about for a century. And so I wonder if you could just really quickly, you know, kind of maybe in 30 seconds or so, as a work historian, what do you think is the biggest lesson that companies today can learn from the history of work that can be applied, embraced, and really embodied by today's organizations, and that could be a really critical move and step towards a better and brighter working future for people?
I think the biggest lesson is that our natural preference in life is to work. The worst thing imaginable is a world of idleness. In fact, when I use that language, it's difficult, because the word idleness comes from an understanding that working is a virtuous thing. Somebody could be working and look as if they're idling, and we impose these assumptions onto work that are just plain don't fit the model. The model is that we want to work in a purposeful way. We want to make change happen. We want to feel at the end of the day that, hey, I did something today. I made a difference. And I think as long as employers understand that and focus their efforts into, you know, promoting that in their workplace, they, you know, ask themselves, you know, are we doing something that's really worthwhile? Are we making good ships? Are we making great TV? Or are we just doing it for a buck? I think, you know, if employers can do that, quality will flow from that, profits will flow from that, cooperation will flow from that, and you know, we may be able to create a better world.
Yeah, great.